Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. The drive from Madison to Milwaukee usually takes about an hour and 20 minutes, but on Thanksgiving night, the empty interstate stretched ahead like a black ribbon under the November moon. My graduation from nursing school in 2008 meant I'd been making this exact trip for over a decade now, always promising Mom I'd text when I got home safe. That night, stomach still full of turkey and green bean casserole, I had the heat cranked up and some true crime podcast playing through the speakers. The host was describing how predators often work in pairs when my headlights caught something moving near the tree line. At first I thought it was just a deer. Wisconsin has millions of them. But then I saw it was smaller, walking weird, favoring one side like it was hurt bad. I pulled over about 30 feet ahead of where I'd seen it, leaving the engine running because something deep in my gut told me to keep the car ready. When I cracked my door open, the dome light illuminated the shoulder, and there it was. This medium-sized dog, maybe 40 pounds, brown and white patches, dragging its back left leg. Poor thing looked like it had been clipped by a car. Not bad enough to be dying, but definitely needing help. The way it whimpered when it tried to walk made my nurse instincts kick in hard. I grabbed the blanket from my back seat, the one I keep for emergencies, thinking I could wrap it up and get it to the emergency vet clinic near my apartment. The dog stayed about 15 feet away, not running but not coming closer either, just standing there shaking in the cold Wisconsin air. That's when I heard the other car approaching behind me, which wasn't unusual, except it slowed down and stopped maybe 20 feet back. No headlights though, which struck me as strange because the highway was dark as hell that night, just their parking lights glowing amber. I figured maybe they saw my hazards and thought I needed help. Happens all the time on these rural stretches. But then, both doors opened at the exact same time, synchronized like they'd practiced it, and two people got out. In my side mirror, I could only make out their shapes against the faint light from their car interior before they shut the doors. One was definitely bigger, broader shoulders, and they both moved with this purposeful walk that made every alarm bell in my head start ringing. "Buster, there you are, buddy," the smaller one called out, voice carrying clear in the still night air. But something about the tone was all wrong, too rehearsed like reading from a script. The dog didn't react at all. Didn't turn its head, didn't wag its tail, nothing. Just kept looking at me with those pain-filled eyes. The bigger one started making kissing sounds, the kind you'd make to call your pet, but he was walking toward my car, not toward the dog. My hand was still on the door handle, half in and half out of the driver's seat, when the smaller one said something that made my whole body go rigid. "Ma'am, could you help us grab him? He doesn't trust strangers, but if you're already out of your car." The dog was between us and them, but neither of them was looking at it. They were both looking at me. Every self-defense class I'd ever taken, every warning my dad had drilled into me since I was 16, it all crystallized in that moment. I yanked my leg back into the car so fast I knocked my knee against the steering column, slammed the door, and hit the lock button. The bigger one broke into a run the second my door closed, and I mean full sprint, covering the distance to my car in seconds. His fist hit my window hard enough that I thought it might crack, and his face pressed against the glass, mouth moving, saying something I couldn't hear over my own screaming. My transmission was still in park, and my fingers felt thick and clumsy as I fumbled for the gear shift. The smaller one had circled around to the passenger side, trying the handle, then pounding on that window too, and between their bodies blocking my mirrors, I couldn't see anything behind me to reverse safely. The dog just stood there through all of this, hadn't moved an inch despite the chaos, and that detail hit me even through my panic. A real injured dog would have bolted or at least reacted to two people running and yelling. I threw the car in drive instead of reverse, flooring it forward, tires squealing on the asphalt. In my rearview mirror, illuminated red by my taillights, I saw them running back to their car, and that's when I noticed they'd left both doors open the whole time, ready for a quick pursuit. My speedometer hit 80 before I even realized it, taking the curves of that dark highway way too fast. But I didn't slow down until I saw the lights of a gas station about 3 miles ahead. My phone was in the cup holder and I grabbed it at a red light, calling 911 with fingers that wouldn't stop trembling. The operator kept me on the line while I pulled into the gas station, parking right in front of the doors where the cameras and lights were. I gave her the mile marker, described the car as best I could. Dark sedan, maybe a Chrysler or Dodge, no front plate that I could see. The two people, one about 6 feet, heavy build, wearing what looked like a baseball cap, the other shorter, thinner, both in dark clothes. While I was talking, a highway patrol officer arrived at the gas station, apparently already in the area, and he took my full statement right there in the parking lot. He radioed for another unit to check that stretch of highway, then looked me straight in the eye and said something that made me want to throw up. "You did the right thing driving off." We've had 2 reports this month of a similar setup. Same area, fake injured animal near the forest. What really got me was when he asked about the dog's behavior, nodding when I described how it didn't react to them calling it or to the commotion. "Probably trained for this," he said, explaining that some people teach dogs to limp on command, reward them for staying still no matter what's happening around them. The thought of someone taking what could have been a sweet family pet and turning it into bait for God knows what made me sick. Another officer called in about 20 minutes later, said they'd found fresh tire marks where I'd described but no sign of the car or the dog. They increased patrols in that area for weeks afterward, but as far as I know, they never caught them. The officer gave me his card, told me to call if I remembered anything else or if I felt unsafe, and suggested I vary my routes home for a while. I didn't sleep that night, or the next 3 nights actually, just kept replaying every second in my mind. The way they moved in perfect coordination, how the smaller one's voice had this fake concerned quality, like someone who'd practiced the line too many times. I started researching similar incidents online and found a rabbit hole of forum posts from truckers and late-night drivers across the Midwest. Same pattern in Illinois, Iowa, Minnesota, always rural highways, always between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m., always targeting women driving alone. Some posts described different bait scenarios, a person flagging for help whose partner hides in the ditch, abandoned baby carriers on the shoulder that are empty when you get close, even fake accident scenes. The consensus was that these operations usually involve human trafficking rings, targeting isolated victims on empty stretches where screams won't be heard and witnesses are non-existent. My mom called the next morning, casual as always, asking if I'd gotten home safe like she always did after family dinners. I couldn't bring myself to tell her what happened, just said yes, traffic was light, everything was fine. But I've told pretty much everyone else, especially women who drive alone, because that's the thing that haunts me most. If I hadn't kept my engine running, if I'd walked those extra 15 feet toward that dog, if I'd been just a little more trusting or a little less paranoid, I would have been another missing person case. They would have found my car on the side of the highway, door open, hazards still blinking, and no trace of where I'd gone. My family would have spent the rest of their lives wondering what happened between Madison and Milwaukee on a cold Thanksgiving night. The detective who followed up a week later told me something that explained why they probably chose that specific spot. The forest there connects to a maze of old logging roads, unmapped paths that lead deep into wilderness where nobody goes in winter. Perfect for moving vehicles unseen, for transferring victims, for making people disappear. He also mentioned that the timing wasn't random. Holiday nights when police are dealing with drunk drivers and domestic calls, when response times to rural areas are slowest. These people had clearly done their homework, studied patterns, knew exactly when and where to set their trap. The fake limp was probably practiced hundreds of times. The dog conditioned with treats and praise until it could hold that injured pose no matter what chaos erupted around it. I still drive that route to visit my parents, though now I take the longer way through town after dark, adding 20 minutes but buying peace of mind. Sometimes I wonder about that dog, whether it was stolen from someone's yard, purchased from a sketchy breeder, or raised from birth for this specific purpose. I wonder if those two people are still out there, maybe in another state now, setting up on some other dark highway with their well-trained decoy. But mostly I think about the women who might have stopped before me, the ones who didn't keep their engines running, who trusted their compassion over their instincts, the ones whose families are still searching, still hoping, still checking their phones for a text that says, "Made it home safe." Denver gets quiet when it snows, and that November night was no exception as I walked Cooper through the empty streets near my apartment. My boots crunched against the fresh powder while Cooper, my golden retriever mix, pulled against his leash, nose buried in every interesting smell along Colfax Avenue. I'd moved into the second-floor unit 6 months earlier, right after signing the divorce papers that officially made me single again at 29. The building was one of those converted Victorians from the 1920s, complete with rattling radiators and floors that announced every footstep, but Cooper and I had made it home. That night started like any other. I'd gotten back from my warehouse shift around 9, found Cooper doing his desperate bathroom dance by the door, and bundled up for our usual evening routine. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and thick snowflakes drifted down steadily, muffling the few sounds of passing cars and turning Denver into something from a snow globe. We made our way past the dumpsters behind the building, Cooper taking his time despite my constant shivering, and I remember noticing how untouched everything looked, like nature had thrown a white blanket over the whole neighborhood. After Cooper finished marking his usual spots, we circled back to the front entrance, passing the old fire escape that clung to the side of our building like a skeleton. Snow had accumulated on every step and platform, creating perfect, undisturbed layers that must have been building up for hours. Something caught my eye as I glanced up at my living room window on the second floor. The curtains I always kept closed were parted slightly in the middle, creating a narrow gap where warm light spilled out into the darkness. Strange, I thought, but figured the old radiator must have kicked on and created enough air movement to shift the fabric. Cooper raced up the interior stairwell ahead of me, leaving wet paw prints on the threadbare carpet, while I trudged behind him, feeling every hour of my shift in my lower back. As we approached apartment 2B, I could hear my TV through the door, but something was different about the sound. I distinctly remembered leaving it on ESPN for the Lakers game, but now I was hearing what sounded like a weather report, that droning meteorologist voice talking about storm systems and weekend forecasts. I unlocked the door and Cooper burst inside, immediately heading for his water bowl in the kitchen while I stood in the doorway, staring at the TV. The local news was on, showing some reporter standing in the snow downtown. But I knew for certain I'd been watching basketball before we left. The remote sat on the coffee table exactly where I'd left it, and for a second I wondered if maybe the cable had glitched, or the game had ended early. I kicked off my wet boots, hung Cooper's leash on the hook, and walked over to grab the remote, switching back to ESPN where the game was still going, fourth quarter with 5 minutes left. My apartment wasn't much, just a basic one-bedroom with a living room that opened to a tiny kitchen. But I'd gotten used to every sound it made, every way the floorboards creaked, and something felt different that night. The air seemed warmer than it should have been, like the heat had been running longer than the 20 minutes we'd been gone. And there was this smell I couldn't quite place, something like wet wool mixed with stale cigarette smoke. Cooper had finished drinking and was now sniffing around near the coat closet by the front door, his tail low and his body tense in that way dogs get when they sense something wrong. I walked over to pull him away, figuring maybe a mouse had gotten in through the walls again when I heard it. A cough. Not loud, kind of muffled and quick, like someone trying to hold it in, and it came from inside the closet. Every muscle in my body locked up, that primitive freeze response when your brain realizes danger before you fully process what's happening. Cooper started growling, this low rumble I'd never heard from him before, his fur standing up along his spine as he faced the closet door. The blood was pounding so hard in my ears I could barely think straight. but I managed to grab Cooper's collar and slowly back toward my bedroom, trying to remember if I'd left my phone in there or if it was still in my jacket pocket. The closet door was one of those old accordion-style ones that never quite closed right, and through the gap at the bottom, I could see the shadow of feet. Work boots, from what I could tell, sized way bigger than mine, with snow still melting off them, creating small puddles on my hardwood floor. My brain went into this weird overdrive mode, simultaneously screaming at me to run, while also cataloging stupid details like how those puddles were going to warp the wood if they sat there too long. Cooper's growling got louder, more aggressive, and whoever was in that closet shifted their weight, making the door rattle slightly on its track. I kept backing up, pulling Cooper with me, when my hip hit the corner of the kitchen counter and knocked over the ceramic bowl where I kept my keys, sending it crashing to the floor. The sound was like a gunshot in the tense silence, and immediately I heard movement from the closet, fast and deliberate, like someone preparing to come out. Without thinking, I yanked Cooper into my bedroom and slammed the door, turning the pathetic little push-button lock that wouldn't stop anyone determined to get in. My hands were trembling so bad I could barely pull my phone from my jacket pocket, nearly dropping it twice before managing to dial 911. While the phone rang, I pressed my ear against the bedroom door and heard heavy footsteps moving through my apartment, not trying to be quiet anymore, just walking around like they owned the place. The dispatcher answered, and I whispered as clearly as I could that someone had broken into my apartment and was still there, giving my address on Colfax Avenue twice because I was so panicked I wasn't sure if I was making sense. She told me units were on the way, to stay where I was, stay on the line, but all I could focus on was the sound of my kitchen drawers being opened, the metallic sliding noise they made, and knowing exactly which drawer held my kitchen knives. The footsteps moved from the kitchen toward the hallway that led to my bedroom, slow and deliberate, and I could hear this raspy breathing that wasn't mine or Cooper's. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept beside my bed, a leftover from my softball league days, and positioned myself between Cooper and the door, trying to control my own breathing so I could hear better. The dispatcher kept asking me questions, but I could barely process them, just kept whispering that he was getting closer. "Please hurry. He's right outside my door now." Then the footsteps stopped, and for maybe 10 seconds that felt like hours. There was complete silence except for Cooper's low, continuous growl, and my heart hammering against my ribs. The doorknob rattled just once, a testing kind of turn to see if it was locked, and then I heard him laugh, this quiet, raspy chuckle that made my whole body go cold. Not angry or frustrated, just amused, like this was all some kind of game to him. I heard him walk back down the hallway, and then came sounds I'll never forget. My couch cushions being moved, papers rustling, drawers opening and closing in my living room desk. He was searching for something, or maybe just going through my things because he could, because he'd been in my space while I was gone, and now felt entitled to it. The dispatcher said police were 3 minutes out, but 3 minutes feels like a lifetime when there's only a thin door and a useless lock between you and someone who broke into your home. Through the bedroom window, I could see the snow still falling steadily, the fire escape outside covered in white, just like I'd seen it from the ground, except now I realized those perfect, undisturbed layers I'd noticed earlier had been a lie. He must have brushed the snow back into place after climbing up, covering his tracks, which meant he'd put thought into this, planned it, watched me leave with Cooper before making his move. Suddenly I heard sirens in the distance getting louder, and the sounds from my living room stopped immediately. Fast footsteps crossed my apartment, and I heard my front door slam open so hard it hit the wall. I stayed frozen in place, bat still raised, Cooper pressed against my legs, listening to those heavy boots running down the interior stairs. The dispatcher was saying something, but I couldn't focus on her words. Just waited until the sirens were right outside my building before I finally unlocked my bedroom door with shaking fingers. My apartment looked like a tornado had gone through it. Every drawer pulled out, cushions thrown around, papers scattered across the floor. The closet door hung open, and inside I could see where he'd pushed aside my coats to hide, the hangers still swaying slightly. There were wet boot prints everywhere, leading from the window to the closet, then throughout my apartment and finally out the front door that still stood wide open. 2 cops showed up first, both younger guys who seemed almost as nervous as I was, followed by an older detective who took one look at the scene and immediately called for the crime scene unit. They found where he'd jimmied my living room window from the fire escape, the lock completely broken, wood splintered around the frame. The detective, a woman named Reeves who had this calming way of talking, explained that there'd been a string of similar break-ins in the neighborhood, always during snowstorms when footprints would be covered quickly, always targeting second-floor apartments with fire escape access. What made me different, she said, was that I'd come home while he was still there. The others had been out for hours, returning to find their places ransacked. They collected fingerprints from the window frame and closet door, took photos of the boot prints before they dried completely, and had me walk through to see if anything was missing. My laptop was still there, my TV, even the cash I'd left on my dresser, which made everything worse somehow, knowing he wasn't after my things but something else, maybe just the thrill of being in someone else's space. Detective Reeves found something I hadn't noticed in my panic, a half-eaten sandwich on my kitchen counter, made with my bread, my turkey, my mustard, with a bite taken out of it like he'd been having a casual lunch. Next to it was an open beer from my fridge, mostly empty, condensation still beading on the bottle. The violation of it hit me harder than the ransacked drawers. This person had made themselves at home, eaten my food, drank my beer, probably sat on my couch and watched my TV while I was walking Cooper in the snow. She bagged everything for evidence and mentioned they'd found similar scenes at other break-ins. The intruder always helping himself to food, always leaving that signature half-eaten meal behind like some kind of calling card. Cooper hadn't left my side since the police arrived, pressing against my legs whenever anyone moved too suddenly, and I knew he'd sensed the danger before I had, tried to warn me with his body language that something was wrong with that closet. They caught him 5 days later, trying the same thing 3 blocks away at another Victorian conversion. The homeowner had installed a security camera after hearing about the break-ins, and it caught him clear as day, climbing the fire escape during another snowstorm. Gregory Watts was his name, 43 years old, had been living in his car since getting evicted 6 months earlier. Detective Reeves called to tell me they'd found items from all the break-ins in his car, including a notebook where he'd written down addresses, schedules, details about the residents. My entry was there. 2B Colfax, single male, dog, walks 9:30 p.m. most nights, works late shift. He'd been watching us for weeks, learning our routine, waiting for the perfect snowy night. The court gave him 18 months and I got a victim notification letter saying he'd be eligible for parole in 9. I moved out the next month, found a place on the ground floor with better locks and no fire escape, though Cooper and I still do our evening walks. But even now, whenever it snows, whenever I come back to find something slightly out of place, a curtain shifted, or a cushion moved, I think about that cough from the closet and check every door, every window, every hiding spot before I can breathe normally again. The week after Halloween always feels strange in our neighborhood, like the whole street is recovering from a sugar hangover, and that Monday in 2018 was no different. I'd just gotten my daughter Chloe to bed around 8:30, which was a miracle considering she was still wired from all the leftover candy I'd stupidly let her have after dinner. Being 33 with a 6-year-old meant most of my evenings looked exactly like this one. Kitchen cleanup, lunch prep for tomorrow, and if I was lucky, maybe 45 minutes of whatever show I was binging before passing out on the couch. We lived in this little ranch-style house just outside Jefferson City. Nothing fancy, but it had a good school district and a big backyard where Chloe could play. The divorce had been finalized that spring, and honestly, those first few months of just the two of us had been harder than I'd expected. But by November, we'd found our rhythm. Around 9:30, right as I was folding the last of Chloe's school uniforms, the doorbell rang. Now, nobody ever came to our door that late on a Monday, especially not in early November when it got dark by 6 and the temperature dropped into the 40s. Through the peephole, I could see two figures in dark hoodies standing on my porch, both probably teenagers from their height and build, though I couldn't make out their faces with the hoods up. They were whispering to each other and giggling, that nervous kind of laugh kids do when they're pulling a prank. I figured they were doing some late trick-or-treating dare, or maybe had lost a bet with their friends. Without opening the door, I flicked the porch light on and off twice, my universal signal for nobody's buying what you're selling, and watched through the side window as they looked at each other, laughed harder, then jogged down my driveway and disappeared into the darkness of the street. I went back to the laundry, but something kept nagging at me about the whole thing. Maybe it was how they'd stood there. Not quite right. Like when you see someone in a play trying too hard to act natural. The taller one had kept his head tilted down the entire time, and the shorter one's giggle had this weird rhythm to it, almost mechanical, like he was forcing it out at regular intervals. But I brushed it off because, honestly, teenagers are weird, and after teaching 3rd grade for 5 years before having Chloe, I'd seen kids do stranger things for attention. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea, checked that the front door was locked, twice actually, and settled into the living room with my laptop to finish some lesson plans for my online tutoring students. 10 minutes later, I heard it. A soft tapping on glass, deliberate and spaced out perfectly. Tap, 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 pause, tap, 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 pause. The sound was coming from the back of the house, from the sliding glass door that opened onto our deck. My whole body went rigid in that awful way where you want to move but can't quite get your muscles to cooperate. The tapping continued, patient and steady, and I could picture someone standing out there in the darkness of my backyard, knuckles against the glass, waiting. The motion sensor light back there had been broken since September. I'd been meaning to fix it but kept putting it off, so whoever was out there was doing this in complete darkness. I grabbed my phone and crept toward the kitchen, staying low, keeping away from the direct line of sight to that glass door. From where I crouched behind the kitchen island, I could barely make out a shape through the glass door, just a dark silhouette against the slightly lighter darkness of the yard beyond. It wasn't moving, just standing there, one arm raised like it was about to knock again. The figure seemed taller than I remembered either of those kids being, but maybe it was just the angle, or maybe one was standing on my deck furniture. I dialed 911 but didn't hit call yet. What would I even say? That someone knocked on my door and now they're in my backyard. The tapping started again, but this time it was different, lower on the door, like whoever was out there had knelt down or bent over. Then I heard something that made my chest tighten. The subtle rattle of the door handle being tested, gentle at first, then a bit more insistent when it didn't budge. My phone screen lit up my face in the darkness, and I swear the silhouette outside shifted, like it had noticed the glow. I held my breath and watched as the shape moved sideways along the glass, disappearing from view, and for maybe 20 seconds, there was nothing, just the hum of the refrigerator and my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then came a scraping sound from the other side of the house, metal on wood, and I realized with horrible clarity what was happening. They were checking the windows. The scraping moved from the guest bedroom window to the bathroom, getting closer to Chloe's room. That broke my paralysis completely. I hit call on 911 and stood up, not caring anymore if they saw me because nobody was getting near my daughter's window, not while I was conscious and breathing. The dispatcher answered on the second ring, and I whispered as clearly as I could that someone was trying to break into my house, gave her my address, and told her my 6-year-old was asleep in her room. She kept me on the line, saying units were on their way, maybe 5 minutes out, and to stay away from windows and doors. But I was already moving down the hallway toward Chloe's room, phone pressed to my ear, when I heard something that stopped me cold. Laughter from outside her window, that same mechanical giggling from earlier, but now it was accompanied by a second voice, deeper, definitely adult, muttering something I couldn't make out. Through the thin curtains of Chloe's room, I could see the shadows of 2 figures right outside, and one of them was doing something to the window screen, pulling at the corner where it met the frame. I burst into Chloe's room and scooped her up while she was still half asleep, blanket and all, and carried her into my bedroom closet on the opposite side of the house. She mumbled something about a bad dream, and I whispered that we were playing a hiding game, that she needed to be super quiet like when we play hide and seek. My beautiful, trusting daughter just nodded against my shoulder and closed her eyes again. The dispatcher was still talking, but I could barely focus on her words because now I could hear them at the front door again. Not knocking this time, but doing something to the lock. A metallic scratching sound that went on for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds. Then suddenly silence. Complete, total silence. Even the dispatcher seemed to sense it because she stopped asking questions and just said, "Officers are 2 minutes out. Stay where you are." We sat in that closet, Chloe breathing softly against my neck, me trying not to hyperventilate, surrounded by the smell of my winter coats and old shoes. Then I heard something that to this day makes me nauseous when I think about it. Footsteps on the roof. Slow, careful footsteps directly above us, moving from the edge toward the center of the house. Our attic access was in the hallway ceiling, just a simple pull-down panel with a folding ladder, and I'd never even thought to check if it locked from the inside. The footsteps stopped right about where that panel would be, and I heard a creaking sound, the kind old wood makes when weight shifts on it. The dispatcher must have heard my breathing change because she whispered that officers were pulling onto my street now, 30 seconds away. The sirens came before the footsteps could move again, and immediately the sounds on the roof turned into scrambling, running, like squirrels but heavier, moving fast toward the back of the house. I heard a thump that must have been someone jumping down, maybe onto the deck, and then nothing. The dispatcher told me to stay put until the officers cleared the scene, and I held Chloe tighter, feeling her little heartbeat against mine. When the police finally gave the all clear and I carried Chloe back to her bed, she was completely asleep, unaware of how close we'd come to something terrible. The officers found footprints in the flower bed below her window. The screen had been cut with what looked like a box cutter, and there were scratch marks on the front door lock, like someone had tried to pick it with amateur tools. But here's the part that still keeps me up at night. The reason I'm sharing this story now, years later, after we've moved to a different state entirely. The next morning, one of the officers came back with a detective, and they asked to see my security camera footage. I'd forgotten about the camera completely. My ex had installed this cheap wireless one by the front door the previous year, and honestly, I rarely checked it. We pulled up the app on my phone and scrolled back to the night before, and what we saw made the detective immediately call for additional units. The first person at my door, the shorter one I'd thought was a teenager, was wearing what looked like a rubber Halloween mask, one of those old man ones with wrinkled skin and wispy gray hair. But it was the taller figure that made everyone in the room go quiet. It was definitely an adult man, probably in his 40s, wearing a teenager's face mask, the kind that just covers the front of your face with elastic bands. The video showed him pulling something from his pocket while the other one rang the doorbell. It was a roll of duct tape. The detective told me they'd been tracking similar attempts in 3 other neighborhoods around Jefferson City that week, always targeting single mothers, always using the same method of sending the masked decoy to the front while the man tried to find another way in. They caught them 2 days later trying the same thing at a house in Fulton, about 20 miles away. The man turned out to be a registered sex offender from Arkansas who'd been violating his parole, and his accomplice was his 19-year-old nephew who he'd convinced to help him. When they searched the man's van, they found zip ties, tape, rope, and a journal with addresses and notes about the routines of different women and their children. My address was in there, along with notes about what time I usually turned off the lights when I left for work, and that I had a young daughter who went to Riverside Elementary. They'd been watching us for at least 2 weeks before that night. I testified at the trial, and he got 25 years. We moved the following summer, and even now, whenever someone knocks on my door after dark, even when I'm expecting them, I check every window and door twice before I go to bed. November always felt heavy in our town, like the air itself was tired from holding up all that gray sky. I'd just turned 17 that September, same week I got my learner's permit, and everything about that fall felt like waiting for something to start. My best friends Garrett and Jenna lived on the same cul-de-sac as me, had since we were in elementary school, and we did everything together. That Saturday night, first weekend of November, the Andersons down on Birchwood were throwing their annual post-Halloween bonfire, the one where everyone brought their leftover candy, and Mr. Anderson told the same ghost stories he'd been telling since we were kids. We went every year, mostly for the tradition now, watching the younger kids jump at the scary parts while we roasted marshmallows and talked about college applications. The fire was dying down around 11 when we decided to walk home, taking the long way through the neighborhood, because none of us wanted the night to end yet. The streets were empty except for a few porch lights and the occasional jack-o'-lantern still glowing on someone's steps, most of them already soft and caving in on themselves. Garrett was doing his terrible impression of Mr. Anderson's voice, making Jenna laugh so hard she had to stop walking, and I remember thinking how perfect everything felt, how these were the moments I'd miss next year when we were all at different schools. We were about 4 blocks from the bonfire when I noticed the van for the first time, this dingy white panel van with rust eating through the wheel wells, crawling along behind us maybe 50 feet back. The weird thing was how it would slow down every time we passed under a streetlight, like the driver was trying to get a better look at us, then speed up slightly in the dark patches between. Garrett was still goofing around, hadn't noticed anything, but Jenna caught my eye and I could tell she'd seen it too. The way her shoulders got tight and she moved a little closer to us. Tried to keep my voice casual when I suggested we cut through the park, thinking maybe the van was just heading the same direction by coincidence. But when we turned onto Sycamore, the van turned too, keeping that same creepy distance. The engine made this low, rumbling sound, not quite healthy, like something was loose under the hood, and I could hear it getting louder and softer as the driver played with the gas pedal. Jenna grabbed my arm then, her fingers digging in through my jacket, and whispered that we should call someone. But who were we going to call? Our parents would freak out, maybe ground us for walking home so late, and we weren't even sure if anything was really wrong yet. The van had tinted windows in the back, completely dark, and the front windshield reflected the streetlights in a way that made it impossible to see who was driving. Garrett finally caught on that something was happening, stopped his joking mid-sentence when he turned and saw the van rolling along behind us. No headlights on now, just these dim orange running lights that made it look like some kind of predator with glowing eyes. We started walking faster without really discussing it, our sneakers scuffing against the sidewalk in this awkward rhythm as we tried not to run but couldn't help speeding up. The van sped up too, engine growling louder, and then did something that made my whole body go rigid with fear. It pulled ahead of us suddenly, maybe 100 feet, and turned into a driveway on the right side of the street, killing all its lights completely. The house it had pulled into was dark, no cars in the driveway except for the van now, and I knew the family that lived there, the Carters, had gone to Florida for a week because their daughter was in my chemistry class, and she'd been complaining about missing the bonfire. The van just sat there in the shadows next to their garage, engine ticking as it cooled, waiting for us to walk past. We stopped dead in the middle of the sidewalk, the 3 of us breathing hard even though we hadn't been running yet, and I could hear Jenna's teeth chattering even though it wasn't that cold. Garrett suggested we cross the street and go back the way we came, but before we could move, the van's reverse lights flashed on, these harsh white rectangles in the darkness, and it started backing out of the driveway, slow and deliberate. The driver had turned the engine back on but kept the headlights off, and the van was rolling backward down the street toward us, weaving slightly like the driver was watching us in the side mirror instead of looking where they were going. That's when we ran, all 3 of us at the same time, no discussion needed, just pure instinct taking over. We cut hard left through someone's yard, my foot catching on a garden hose and nearly sending me face first into their lawn gnome collection, Jenna pulling me up by my elbow as we scrambled between 2 houses. Behind us, I could hear the van's engine roar as it accelerated. tires squealing as it tried to turn around in the narrow street, and then the sound of a car door slamming that sent ice through my veins. We burst into the backyard of a house I didn't recognize, motion sensor floods blazing to life and lighting us up like we were on stage, and Garrett was already pulling out his phone, his hands fumbling with the passcode. The backyard connected to another street through a gap in the fence, and we squeezed through, splinters from the old wood catching on our clothes, ripping Jenna's jacket sleeve. I could taste copper in my mouth from running so hard, and my legs felt disconnected from my body, like they belonged to someone else who just happened to be carrying me along. We were on Oakmont now, at least 6 blocks from where the van had been, and Garrett finally got through to 911, practically shouting our location into the phone while we crouched behind someone's SUV. The operator kept asking him to slow down, to explain what was happening, but how could we explain something that sounded so paranoid when you said it out loud? A van was following us. The driver turned around to chase us. We were hiding now behind a random car, praying the van wouldn't cruise down this street next. The police showed up faster than I expected, 2 cruisers with their lights on but no sirens, and the officers separated us to get our stories while we stood there in the middle of Oakmont, looking like we'd been through a hurricane. My officer, this older guy with a thick gray mustache who introduced himself as Officer Brennan, actually believed us right away, didn't give us any grief about being out late or suggest we were imagining things. He radioed the description of the van to other units, then drove us around the neighborhood in the back of his cruiser, asking us to point out exactly where everything had happened. When we got to the Carter house where the van had pulled in, there were fresh tire marks in the driveway, deep grooves in the gravel where it had reversed hard, and Officer Brennan took photos with his phone, measured the wheelbase with a tape measure from his trunk. He said something into his radio about checking camera footage from the ATM at the bank on Sycamore, which would have captured any vehicle passing that intersection. About an hour later, while we were sitting in the police station waiting for our parents and drinking hot chocolate that tasted like chalk, Officer Brennan came back with this expression on his face that made my chest tighten all over again. They'd found the van, he said, abandoned in the parking lot of Westfield Middle School, still warm, driver's door hanging open. The weird part was what they found inside. 3 rolls of duct tape, a box of zip ties, and a notebook with addresses written in it, including several houses in our neighborhood with the days and times written next to them. The Carter house was on the list with "out of town" written beside it, and there were notes about 3 targets, with descriptions that matched me, Garrett, and Jenna pretty well, down to Jenna's purple backpack and Garrett's varsity jacket. The van had been reported stolen from a plumbing company 2 towns over 3 days earlier, and they never found who'd been driving it that night, despite pulling prints and checking every security camera they could find. Our parents went into full protective mode after that, driving us everywhere for weeks, installing new security systems, organizing neighborhood watch meetings that packed the community center. The detective assigned to our case, a woman named Diane Lawson who wore these thick-rimmed glasses and always had a coffee stain somewhere on her shirt, told us we'd likely been watched for days, maybe weeks, that whoever was in that van had been planning something specific. She showed us footage from the bank ATM that caught the van passing by earlier that evening, before the bonfire even started, just circling the neighborhood in slow loops. You could make out a figure in the driver's seat, baseball cap pulled low, but the quality was too grainy to get any real details. The notebook had our routines written down: when we walked to school, when we stayed after for clubs, when we typically hung out at the park on weekends, and Detective Lawson said we were lucky we'd varied our pattern that night by going to the bonfire. The middle school where they found the van had security cameras too, but whoever ditched it there knew exactly where the blind spots were, parking in the one corner where 3 broken cameras created a perfect dead zone. The only glimpse they got was a figure in dark clothes walking quickly away from the van, heading toward the tree line at the back of the school property. And by the time the K-9 unit arrived, the trail had gone cold at the creek that ran behind the playground. What haunted me most were the small details the detective mentioned almost offhandedly. Fresh scratches on the inside of the van's rear doors, like someone had been testing the locks from inside, and a receipt from a hardware store dated that morning for the zip ties and tape, paid in cash at a store 40 miles away. Whoever it was had driven 40 miles just to buy those supplies where no one would recognize them, then driven back to hunt us. For weeks after that night, every white van made me stop breathing for a second. Every stranger who looked at us a beat too long made my skin prickle with that same fear. Jenna started carrying pepper spray and taking a different route home every day, never the same pattern twice, and Garrett's older brother started picking him up from school in his pickup truck, wouldn't let him walk anywhere alone. The police increased patrols in our neighborhood, and for about a month there was always a cruiser parked near the school, or doing slow loops through our streets. But eventually, things went back to normal, at least on the surface. Detective Lawson called us in December to say they'd connected our case to 2 similar incidents in neighboring counties. Same pattern with the white van and the notebook. But those kids hadn't been as lucky as us, hadn't run fast enough, though she wouldn't give us details about what had happened to them. The case never got solved, at least not while we were still in high school, and by the time I left for college the following year, it had become just another unsolved mystery in the filing cabinets at the police station. Sometimes I Google it, looking for updates or similar cases, wondering if whoever was in that van that night ever got caught somewhere else, but I never find anything definitive. What I can't forget is that moment when the van reversed toward us in the dark, how deliberate it was, how patient they'd been watching us for weeks, learning our habits and waiting for the perfect opportunity. Jenna, Garrett, and I are still close, even though we're spread across different states now. And every November when we text each other around the anniversary, none of us mentions it directly, but we all know what we're really checking on, making sure we're all still okay, still here, still running faster than whatever was chasing us that night. Snow was coming to Plattsburgh that Monday, and I could smell it in the air when I stepped onto my porch with my morning coffee. After 26 years of marriage to Nathan, I'd gotten pretty good at reading warning signs, though apparently not good enough to avoid the October divorce that left me starting over in a duplex that smelled like old wood and whatever the previous tenant had been cooking for the past decade. Frank, my elderly landlord who lived in the other half, had promised quick maintenance response times, which mattered since teaching 7th grade. Math didn't leave me much energy for home repairs. The place had its charm, though, with original hardwood floors and tall windows that actually opened, unlike the sealed disasters in most modern apartments. I'd been there exactly 9 days, still discovering which floorboards creaked and which light switches controlled what. That morning started like the others since I'd moved in, except for the weather forecast promising 6 to 8 inches by nightfall. I stood in my living room, watching the sky turn that sick yellow color that precedes every upstate storm, when I heard this weird scraping noise from below. Real faint, almost like fingernails on concrete, but steady and deliberate. I got down on the floor, pressed my ear against the cold wood and listened. The sound went on for maybe 10 seconds, paused, then started again. The heating had just kicked on, so I figured it was probably the old pipes doing their thing, or maybe Frank was organizing something in our shared basement. He'd mentioned he kept holiday decorations down there. I finished my coffee, grabbed my stack of ungraded tests, and drove to school through streets that were already emptying out in anticipation of the storm. School let out early at 1:30 because of the weather, and by the time I pulled into my driveway, thick flakes were already coating everything. Frank's car was gone, which wasn't unusual since he mentioned he spent Mondays at his daughter's place in Malone, about an hour west. I brought in an armload of firewood from the covered pile out back, thinking I'd grade papers by the fireplace and enjoy my first real snow day in the new place. But when I walked through the front door, I noticed something immediately wrong. My living room rug, this cheap burgundy thing I'd bought at Target the previous week, was pushed up at one corner, like someone had tripped over it. I specifically remembered straightening it that morning after catching my toe on the edge, and there was this smell, really subtle but definitely there, like unwashed clothes mixed with something else I couldn't identify. The scraping sound started again while I was standing there with my arms full of firewood. And this time it was louder, more insistent. It was definitely coming from directly beneath the living room, right under where I was standing. I dropped the wood on the couch and went to the basement door in the kitchen, flipping on the light switch at the top of the stairs. The single bulb down there barely illuminated anything beyond the wooden steps. I called out, asking if Frank was down there, even though I knew his car was gone. No response, but the scraping stopped immediately, like whatever was making the noise had heard me. I stood there at the top of those stairs for probably a full minute, listening to nothing but my own breathing and the tick of snow hitting the kitchen windows. Every instinct told me not to go down there alone, but I kept thinking about how Frank would react if I called him at his daughter's house over what was probably just a raccoon or some pipes that needed adjusting. I grabbed a flashlight from the junk drawer and made my way down, each step creaking under my weight. The basement was exactly what you'd expect from a house this old. Stone foundation walls, exposed ceiling joists covered in cobwebs, and that damp earth smell that never quite goes away. Frank's half was sectioned off with a piece of plywood, and there were a few cardboard boxes labeled Xmas and Easter stacked against the divider. My side was mostly empty except for the furnace, water heater, and some old shelving units the previous tenant had left behind. I swept the flashlight beam across the floor, looking for any signs of animals or water damage that might explain the noise. That's when I noticed the coal chute door in the far corner, something I hadn't even known existed until that moment. These old houses used to get coal deliveries straight into the basement, and most people just sealed them up decades ago when they converted to gas or oil heat. But this one wasn't sealed anymore. The metal door, maybe 2 feet by 2 feet, was hanging open about 6 inches, and there were fresh scratch marks on the concrete floor leading from it toward the center of the basement. I walked closer, my flashlight beam shaking slightly, and that's when the smell hit me full force. Body odor, stale food, and something sickly sweet like overripe fruit. I pulled the door open wider and aimed my light inside. There was a blue sleeping bag, one of those cheap Coleman ones you can get at any sporting goods store, spread out in the crawl space beyond the chute. Empty Chef Boyardee cans were stacked neatly against one wall, along with water bottles, some still half full. But the thing that made my chest go tight was the phone charger plugged into my outlet, the cord snaking back through the opening to a spot I couldn't see. Someone had been living in my basement, probably had been there before I even moved in, and they were still coming and going through that old coal chute that opened up near the bushes on the side of my house. I backed away from the coal chute so fast I knocked over one of the empty shelving units, the metal crash echoing through the basement. My phone was upstairs, and suddenly that seemed like the stupidest thing in the world, coming down here without it. Turned to run back up the stairs and saw something that made me stop cold. There were footprints in the dust on the concrete floor, fresh ones that weren't mine, leading from the coal chute to the stairs. Not just one set either, but multiple tracks going back and forth, some of them made by bare feet. The most recent ones, still sharp and clear in the dust, went right up to the basement door I'd just come through. This person, whoever they were, had been walking through my kitchen, my living room, probably standing right behind me while I slept on the couch that first week after moving in, too exhausted to make it to my bedroom. I ran up those stairs faster than I'd moved in years, slammed the basement door behind me, and dragged a kitchen chair under the doorknob. My phone was on the counter, and I called 911 with fingers that wouldn't stop trembling. While I waited for the police, I stood at my front window watching the snow pile up, wondering if whoever had been living beneath my floors was out there somewhere, watching me back. The dispatcher stayed on the line, asking me questions I could barely answer because I kept thinking about all those nights I'd heard the house settling, all those mornings I'd found things slightly out of place and blamed my post-divorce brain fog. The woman on the phone kept telling me to stay calm, that officers were on their way, but the snow was coming down harder now and I knew the roads would slow them down. 20 minutes, she said, maybe 30 with the weather. I moved every piece of furniture I could lift in front of the basement door, creating a barricade, that would at least make noise if someone tried to come through. The wait felt like hours, but it was probably only 15 minutes before I heard something that made my whole body go rigid. The scraping sound again, but this time it wasn't coming from below. It was coming from outside, near the living room window, like metal against wood. I crept to the window, staying low, and peeked through the blinds. There was a man out there, skinny and hunched over, wearing a filthy green army jacket that was way too big for him. He had stringy gray hair that hung past his shoulders, and a beard that looked like it hadn't been trimmed in months. He was using something, maybe a screwdriver or a knife, trying to pry open my window from the outside. The snow was coming down so thick I could barely make out his features, but I could see his lips moving like he was talking to himself, and his breath came out in quick white puffs that disappeared into the storm. When he looked up, maybe sensing me watching, his eyes met mine through the gap in the blinds, and they were the palest blue I'd ever seen, almost white, like a husky dog's eyes. He didn't run when he saw me. He just stood there, still gripping whatever tool he'd been using, snow accumulating on his shoulders and in his tangled hair. Then he smiled, not a normal smile, but something that showed too many teeth, yellowed and broken, and he pressed his face right up against the glass. I could see dirt caked under his fingernails as he tapped on the window, 3 soft knocks like he was visiting a friend. The dispatcher was asking what was happening, but I couldn't form words. The man outside tilted his head, studying me like I was something fascinating he'd discovered, and then he spoke loud enough for me to hear through the glass. He said my name, my actual first name, clear as day. Not yelling, not threatening, just conversational, like we were old acquaintances. He knew who I was. He'd probably gone through my mail, my papers, everything I'd thrown away since moving in. He knew my schedule, when I left for work, when I came home. He'd been living underneath me, learning me, and now with the police still minutes away and the snow creating a white wall around my house, he wanted me to know that he knew. I screamed at him to get away, that the police were coming, and that seemed to amuse him because he actually laughed, this wet, rattling sound that I could hear even through the window. Then he held up something in his other hand, and it took me a second to realize what it was. My spare house key, the one I'd hidden under a decorative rock by the back door my second day there. He dangled it between his thumb and finger, making sure I could see it clearly through the falling snow, and then he walked away from the window, disappearing around the corner of the house. The dispatcher was practically yelling at me now, telling me to get to a room with a lock to barricade myself in, but all I could think about was that he had a key, had probably always had it, and every night I'd locked my doors thinking I was safe. He could have walked right in whenever he wanted. I ran to my bedroom, slammed the door, and shoved my dresser in front of it, the wood scraping across the floor just like the sound I'd been hearing from the basement. I could hear him now, the front door opening. Not forced, not broken, just the normal sound of a key turning in a lock and the door swinging open on its hinges. His footsteps were slow and deliberate on the hardwood, and he was humming something, some tune I didn't recognize. The dispatcher said the police were 3 minutes out, maybe less, but I could hear him in my kitchen now, opening drawers, looking for something. Then the footsteps came toward the bedroom, and he knocked on the door, polite as could be, and asked if I wanted to talk about the rent. The rent, like he owned the place, like I was the intruder. He said Frank had promised him he could stay, that they had an arrangement, that I wasn't supposed to be here yet. His voice was calm, reasonable even, which made it so much worse. He said he'd been waiting for the right time to introduce himself, that he didn't mean to scare me, that we could share the space if I wanted. The dresser shook as he tested the door, and I could see the wood starting to splinter near the lock. Then the sirens cut through everything, that beautiful wailing sound getting louder every second. The pressure on my bedroom door stopped immediately, and I heard his footsteps retreat fast across the living room. The front door slammed, and through my bedroom window I watched him sprint through the snow toward the tree line behind the house, that oversized army jacket flapping behind him like wings. The police found me still barricaded in my bedroom, and it took 3 officers to convince me it was safe to move the dresser. They searched the basement, documented everything. The sleeping bag, the food, a notebook filled with observations about my daily routine written in pencil, even sketches of me sleeping on the couch. They found where he'd been getting in and out through the coal chute, the outside opening hidden behind an overgrown juniper bush that Frank apparently hadn't trimmed in years. The man's name was Howard Pelletier, a local who'd been in and out of psychiatric facilities for decades. Frank's nephew recognized him from the description and said Howard used to do odd jobs for Frank years ago, back before his mental health completely deteriorated. They never caught him that night. The snow covered his tracks within an hour, and he knew those woods better than anyone. But they boarded up the coal chute, changed all my locks, and a patrol car sat outside my duplex for the next 3 nights. I moved out the following week, stayed with my sister in Albany until I found a new place, this time a modern apartment on the 3rd floor with proper locks and a security system. Frank tried to keep my security deposit, said I broke the lease, but I had a lawyer friend write him a letter that changed his mind real quick. I heard from another teacher months later that Howard turned up at a homeless shelter in Burlington when the weather got bad in January. The police arrested him there, and he went back to a psychiatric facility, though for how long I never found out. I still teach at the same school, still grade papers in the evening, but now I live in a place where every sound has an explanation, where footsteps belong to neighbors I know by name, and where the only thing under my floor is another apartment with a young couple who play their music too loud on weekends. And that's fine by me. The cold had teeth that November night in Alaska, the kind that bites through 3 layers of clothing and makes your bones ache. I'd been hauling frozen seafood from Anchorage down to Fairbanks for about 6 years by then, enough runs to know every pothole and curve on the park's highway. My rig, a beat-up Peterbilt that had seen better days sometime during the Clinton administration, was parked at a pull-off near mile marker 147, one of those spots truckers use when the official rest areas are full or too far away. The heater was running on low, just enough to keep the frost from forming inside the windshield, and I'd wedged myself into the sleeper cab with my usual setup. Sleeping bag rated for -40, wool socks doubled up, and my phone charging on the little shelf I'd installed myself. Outside, the darkness was absolute, that special kind of black you only get when you're 50 miles from the nearest town, and the clouds are covering whatever stars might be brave enough to shine. I remember checking my watch right before falling asleep, one of those habits you develop when your life revolves around delivery schedules and hours of service regulations. The green digits showed 9:47 p.m., which meant I could get a solid 6 hours before I needed to start rolling again to make my morning drop-off. The last thing I heard was the tick-tick-tick of the engine cooling down, metal contracting in the cold, a sound as familiar to me as my own heartbeat. Sleep came easy that night, the exhaustion of 14 hours on icy roads pulling me under like quicksand. I'd parked here probably 30 times before, always the same spot where the ground was level enough that I wouldn't wake up with a crick in my neck from sleeping at an angle. Other truckers knew about this place too, but tonight I was alone, just my rig and the occasional groan of wind pushing against the trailer. The knocking started at 1:14 a.m. according to that same watch when I jolted awake. 3 measured raps on the driver's side window, not frantic but deliberate, like someone calmly trying to get your attention at a store counter. My first thought was another trucker, maybe somebody who'd blown a tire or needed jumper cables. Happens more than you'd think out here. I sat up in the dark, my breath fogging in the cold air, and fumbled for the little LED flashlight I keep velcroed to the wall. The knocking came again, same pattern. 3 steady knocks that echoed hollow against the glass. Through the sleeper cab's small window, I could barely make out a shape standing beside my door, just a dark outline against the darker night. The person stepped back when they saw me moving, giving me room to climb forward into the driver's seat. When I clicked on the flashlight and aimed it through the window, the beam lit up a man's face that I'll never forget. Not because it was scary or deformed or anything like that, but because it was so perfectly ordinary except for one detail. He was sweating. Here was this guy, standing in -20 weather, wearing just a flannel shirt and jeans. No coat, no gloves, and there were actual beads of sweat running down his forehead. He had sandy hair cut short, maybe mid-40s, clean-shaven. The kind of face you'd see at any hardware store or gas station and forget 5 minutes later. But that sweat, it was wrong, like seeing someone sunbathing in a blizzard. He smiled when the light hit him, raised his hand in a little wave, and mouthed something I couldn't hear through the glass. I cracked the window maybe 2 inches, keeping my hand on the gear shift out of habit, ready to fire up the engine if needed. "Hey there, friend," he said, and his voice was steady, casual, like we were meeting at a barbecue instead of a frozen pull-off in the middle of nowhere. "Sorry to wake you, but my car died about a quarter-mile back, just around that curve. Battery's fine, engine turns over, but she won't catch. Think it might be the fuel line freezing up. Happens all the time up here, right?" He wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, and I watched the sweat immediately freeze into tiny crystals on his skin. "I was wondering if you could help me push it, get it rolling downhill a bit. Sometimes that's all it takes to get the fuel flowing again. 2 strong guys like us shouldn't take more than 5 minutes." His eyes never left mine the whole time he talked, not blinking much, just steady eye contact that felt rehearsed somehow. The thing about truckers is we help each other out. It's an unwritten rule of the road. I've changed more tires and given more jump starts than I can count, pulled guys out of ditches, shared food when somebody's broke down waiting for a tow. But every instinct I developed in 20 years of driving was screaming at me that something was wrong with this picture. Beyond the sweat, beyond the lack of winter clothes, there was the timing. He said his car was a quarter-mile back, but I'd been asleep for over 3 hours and hadn't heard any vehicle pass by. And trust me, you hear everything in a quiet night like that. The gravel crunches, the engine noise carries, especially around curves where people tap their brakes. Plus, if his car really wouldn't start, how was pushing it going to help with a frozen fuel line? That's not how engines work, and anybody who drives in Alaska knows that. "Where's your coat?" I asked through the crack in the window, watching my breath turn to ice crystals in the air between us. The question seemed to catch him off guard for just a second, his smile flickering like a TV losing signal, before coming back full strength. "Left it in the car," he said, laughing a little. "Stupid, I know, but I was so frustrated when she died that I just started walking. Figured I'd find help quick. Been walking for maybe 20 minutes now, worked up quite a sweat actually. Come on, man. I'm freezing out here despite how it looks. My wife's gonna kill me if I don't make it home tonight. Got my daughter's recital tomorrow, she's playing violin, first chair." He pulled out a wallet, started showing me a photo through the window. But in the dark, with just my flashlight, all I could see was the reflection on the plastic sleeve. I kept the window cracked, but didn't move to open the door, and I could see his patience starting to wear thin, though he tried to hide it. His jaw muscles tightened just a bit, and he shifted his weight from foot to foot, not like someone cold, but like someone getting ready for something. "Tell you what," I said, trying to sound helpful. "Let me call you a tow truck. I've got good cell signal here, and there's a 24-hour service out of Cantwell. They could be here in maybe an hour." I reached for my phone, making a show of it, but kept my eyes on him. That's when his whole demeanor changed, like dropping a mask. The friendly smile disappeared, replaced by something flat and calculating. "No need for that," he said, his voice different now, lower, more insistent. "Just need you to step out for 5 minutes. Your truck will be fine, I promise. Just need some help pushing, that's all." That's when I saw it, just a glimpse in my side mirror, movement behind my trailer, maybe 30 feet back. Another person, trying to stay in the shadows, moving slowly along the passenger side of my rig. The man at my window must have seen my eyes flick to the mirror because he immediately knocked harder, trying to get my attention back. "Hey, come on, buddy, don't leave me hanging here. Alaska rules, right? We help each other out." His hand went to his pocket, and I didn't wait to see what he was reaching for. I cranked the engine, and the Peterbilt roared to life, diesel smoke billowing black in the cold air. The man jumped back from the door, and in my passenger mirror, I saw the second person sprint away from my truck, heading for the tree line. I slammed the truck into gear and hit the air release, the brakes hissing like angry snakes. The man was shouting something now, but I couldn't hear it over the engine noise, didn't want to hear it. As I pulled out, my headlights swept across the pull-off, and that's when I saw their vehicle, tucked behind a cluster of spruce trees where I hadn't noticed it before. A dark pickup truck with the engine running, exhaust visible in the cold, a third person sitting in the driver's seat. No broken down car, no mechanical trouble, just 3 people who'd been waiting in the dark for someone to stop. I gunned it onto the highway, checking my mirrors constantly for the next 10 miles, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. My CB radio was crackling with static, and with shaking fingers I switched to Channel 19, the trucker's channel, to warn anyone else who might be heading that way. The chatter on the CB that night is what really made everything sink in. About 40 minutes after I'd gotten back on the road, still jumpy at every set of headlights in my mirrors, I heard another driver, handle was Kodiak Bear, talking about something that happened at the Broad Pass rest area, maybe 15 miles from where I'd been parked. A driver had stopped to use the facilities, left his rig running like we all do in winter to keep the diesel from gelling, came back to find 2 men inside his cab. They'd beaten him pretty bad when he tried to stop them, left him on the ground with a concussion and broken ribs while they took off with his truck and $50,000 worth of electronics he'd been hauling to Fairbanks. The state troopers found the truck 6 hours later, abandoned and stripped clean off a logging road. Kodiak Bear said the driver was lucky to be alive, that the temperature had dropped to -30 that night, and if another trucker hadn't found him 20 minutes later, he would have frozen to death right there in that rest area parking lot. I made my delivery in Fairbanks the next morning, barely slept for the next 3 nights, kept seeing that sweating face at my window every time I closed my eyes. Filed a report with the troopers, described everything I could remember, but they said, without a license plate or better description of the vehicle, there wasn't much they could do. The officer I talked to, a woman who'd been working the highways for 15 years, told me I'd probably saved my own life by trusting my instincts. She said these kinds of setups were getting more common, groups targeting long-haul truckers because we often carry valuable cargo and always have diesel fuel, which sells good on the black market. The sweat on that man's face still bothers me when I think about it, and I finally figured out why he was sweating in that cold. Adrenaline, pure and simple. He was pumped up for violence, ready to do whatever it took to get me out of that cab. Now I sleep with a crowbar next to my bed in the sleeper, and I never crack my window for anyone at night, no matter how legitimate their story sounds. That pull-off at mile marker 147 is still there, but I never stop at it anymore. I'd rather drive an extra hour tired than park in that particular darkness again. The break had been long overdue. Weeks of back-to-back meetings, constant messages, and the kind of exhaustion that makes every day blur together had started to eat away at me. When an ad for a digital detox retreat appeared on my laptop screen late one night, the idea sounded perfect. A quiet lodge tucked somewhere in the Oregon countryside. No screens, no distractions, just time to recharge. The price was low enough to make me wonder if it was some new wellness startup trying to build a reputation, but I booked it anyway. I needed silence more than I needed logic. The drive there took most of a gray November afternoon. The roads grew narrower and lonelier the farther I went, the trees swallowing what little sunlight there was. The sign for Airvale Lodge looked almost handmade, nailed to a crooked wooden post by the side of the road. When I finally pulled into the gravel lot, my phone had no signal. I took it as a good sign, a forced break from everything. The main building looked rustic, a wide porch lined with mismatched rocking chairs, and a carved wooden door that groaned when it opened. A woman in a beige uniform greeted me inside. Her voice was gentle but rehearsed, every word precise. She asked for my name, then reached out her hand and said they'd be holding on to all electronic devices for the duration of the program. Before I could protest, Another staff member appeared with a tray lined with numbered envelopes. My phone went into one, sealed with a sticker that read "Serenity requires surrender." They gave me a cotton uniform and a name tag. My own name printed in bold black letters. "Participants blend better that way," the woman said with a kind of warmth that didn't invite questions. Dinner that night felt strange. Everyone wore the same pale clothes, moving quietly around the long wooden tables. No one seemed to know each other, but they acted like they did. Smiling, nodding, serving food in synchronized rhythm. The staff stood along the walls, watching, never eating. When I tried to make small talk with the woman sitting beside me, she simply said, "It's easier if you let go of words." I laughed awkwardly, thinking it was part of the retreat's minimalist philosophy, but something about her expression stayed with me through the night. The next morning began with a bell that rang through the halls at dawn. Everyone lined up in the courtyard like students waiting for roll call. The air smelled like pine and damp soil, and the mist hung low between the trees surrounding the property. A man who introduced himself only as Guy Thomas gave a short speech about releasing digital toxins and rediscovering natural rhythm. His tone was calm, but every sentence carried the kind of certainty that made me uneasy. When I asked how long the program lasted, he smiled without answering. "You will know when it ends," he said, as if it were something obvious. The day unfolded with scheduled silence and strange rituals. We had to walk in single file along forest trails, pause at marked stones, and write affirmations on paper that were later burned in a communal fire pit. Meals were timed to the minute. Every clock in the lodge showed the same hour, even though the sunlight shifted throughout the day. When I asked another participant how long she'd been there, she looked around before whispering. I stopped counting after the third sunrise. Her eyes darted to the nearest staff member. Then she smiled tightly, like she regretted saying it. By the afternoon, the sense of calm that the staff tried to impose had started to crack. I noticed people pacing near the windows or staring too long at the locked gate beyond the main courtyard. I decided to test it myself during a meditation session when everyone's eyes were closed. The gravel path leading to the exit was longer than it looked, and my steps sounded louder than they should have. When I reached the gate, a heavy chain looped through its bars. A padlock the size of my hand hung in the middle. Through the metal, I could see the empty road stretching into the trees. No cars, no signs of movement, only silence so deep it felt staged. That evening, I went to the front desk and asked for my phone. The receptionist, a young man with perfect posture and a voice too calm, checked a list behind the counter. "You signed the agreement," he said, not even looking at me. "You're here until the program ends." I asked again, louder this time, and he repeated the same line word for word as if rehearsed. A couple of staff members appeared behind him, blocking the hallway. Their faces were blank, but their stance wasn't. That was the moment I realized no one here was simply following wellness routines. They were following orders. That night, I barely slept. The lodge walls seemed thinner, the quiet heavier. From my room window, I could see the courtyard dimly lit by lanterns, shadows moving in slow, deliberate patterns. Around midnight, a low hum echoed through the trees, not an engine or generator, but a rhythmic pulse that grew louder every few seconds. When I opened my door to listen, 2 staff members were standing at the end of the hallway, facing me. Neither spoke, but one raised a finger to his lips, motioning for silence. I shut the door and pressed my back against it, heart pounding in my chest. The following morning, the woman I'd spoken to at dinner was gone. Her bed was neatly made, her name tag missing from the wall hook. When I asked one of the cleaners where she'd gone, she replied, she completed her process. That phrase circulated throughout the day like a chant, whispered during meals, murmured by staff, written on the whiteboard in the hall. Completion is peace. By then, I understood that no one here was trying to rest or heal. They were being reshaped into something obedient. I decided to escape that night. During the final group meditation, I hid one of the metal utensils from the dining table under my sleeve. When the lights dimmed, I slipped out through a service corridor that smelled of bleach and wet wood. The kitchen door opened to the back of the property, near the same gate I'd tried before. Using the fork, I wedged the chain loose enough to slip it free of the latch. My fingers were raw, the sound of metal scraping metal slicing through the still air. For a second, I thought I heard footsteps behind me, but I didn't look back. I just ran. The road beyond the gate stretched into the forest. No lights, no signs, just endless darkness. I walked for what felt like hours until a delivery truck appeared in the distance. The driver, an older man with tired eyes, slowed down when he saw me. I told him I'd been hiking and got lost. He didn't ask questions. When I reached the nearest town, I went straight to the police. They said there was no record of a place called Airvale Lodge anywhere in the county, and no retreat registered under that name. I have searched for it online since then, and the website that first drew me in no longer exists. I still have the name tag they gave me. Plain white plastic, my name printed in black letters. Sometimes I catch myself staring at it, trying to remember the faces of the people still inside those walls. I never saw them again, but sometimes late at night, I hear that same low hum from the woods behind my apartment. The coast feels different once the tourists are gone. The air turns sharp, the sand loses its warmth, and the ocean seems louder, as if it is reclaiming the silence. I had taken a last-minute freelance gig, planning to spend a quiet November in a small beach house outside a fishing village in Maine. The owner's photos showed weathered shingles, pale blue shutters, and a wraparound porch that faced the sea. It looked like the kind of place where time slowed down, exactly what I needed to finish a photo series before the snow came. The house itself stood a few miles from town, down a narrow road lined with pines. The front steps creaked under my boots as I carried my gear inside. It smelled faintly of salt and old books, the kind of musty comfort that hinted at years of damp air. The layout was simple. Kitchen and living room downstairs, 2 bedrooms on the main floor, and a staircase that ended at a locked door labeled storage only. The host had mentioned that the upper floor wasn't in use, so I didn't think much about it then. That first day passed quietly. I spent the afternoon walking along the dunes, catching the late sunlight breaking through thick clouds. When night came, the wind began to howl through the cracks in the window frames. The house groaned and shifted with every gust, but there was something peaceful about it. I made tea, edited a few photos, and fell asleep on the couch with the faint hiss of the ocean outside the window. Sometime in the middle of the night, a sound woke me. It was steady and rhythmic, not the wind, not the surf. Footsteps. Light but deliberate, pacing directly above me. I sat up, the couch springs creaking beneath me, and listened. The steps moved slowly from one end of the ceiling to the other, then stopped. My brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe pipes, maybe the house settling, but then a faint tune drifted through the air. Music. Something old, scratchy, like a record playing from another room. I turned off the lamp and held my breath, trying to locate the source of the sound. The melody had a strange quality, a waltz maybe, though the notes seemed warped and distant, like it was being played from behind thick walls. I checked the time. It was close to 3 in the morning. I finally grabbed my flashlight and climbed the stairs. Each step made the old boards groan under my weight. When I reached the door, the music stopped. The silence that followed felt heavier than the dark around me. I tried the handle. It did not budge. Locked. From the inside. I knocked softly, half expecting someone to answer, half hoping no one would. Nothing. My pulse hammered in my ears as I pressed my ear to the wood. Faint shuffling, a drag of movement like someone turning in place. Then, a single thump against the door. I stumbled back, nearly losing my balance on the steps. For a moment, I stood there frozen in disbelief, trying to make sense of what I had just heard. Eventually, I forced myself back downstairs, locked my bedroom door, and waited for daylight. The morning light made everything seem harmless again. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself I had probably been dreaming. Still, curiosity got the better of me. I walked around the outside of the house, camera in hand, tracing the roofline. The upper floor windows were there all right, 3 of them, boarded up, paint peeling away in uneven strips. No lights, no movement. Just the wind rattling the loose boards. I snapped a few photos more out of habit than intention, and went back inside to make coffee. When I messaged the host, I kept it polite. I asked if anyone might have been doing maintenance upstairs, mentioning the music. The reply came quickly. The house doesn't have an upstairs anymore. It was destroyed in a fire years ago. I stared at the screen, rereading it. I could still hear the footsteps in my head, the pattern of them, deliberate and human. I wanted to argue, to ask for proof, but something about the certainty in their message stopped me. Instead, I typed a short thank you and set the phone face down on the counter. That evening, I avoided going near the stairs. I cooked dinner with the radio on just to drown out the creaks of the house. Around midnight, the wind picked up again, carrying the smell of seaweed and smoke through a gap in the window frame. I sat in the living room, scrolling through my camera roll, when something caught my attention. One of the exterior shots I had taken that morning. In the reflection of an upstairs window, behind the warped glass, there was a faint outline of a person. The shape was blurred, but there was no mistaking it. Someone had been standing there, watching. Sleep was impossible after that. I kept the lights on and stayed by the window until dawn. The next morning, I decided to check the attic space from the outside again. The boards over the windows looked undisturbed, but when I touched the edges, flakes of charcoal rubbed off on my fingers. Beneath the wood, the smell of burnt plaster seeped out, faint but distinct. I followed the scent around the back of the house and found a small hatch hidden under the eaves, sealed with rusted nails. It looked like no one had touched it in years. I packed my things that afternoon, told the host I had a family emergency, and left before the sky darkened. As I drove away, I glanced once in the rearview mirror. The upstairs windows were still boarded, but for a moment I could swear one of the boards shifted slightly, just enough for a sliver of darkness to peer through. I didn't stop to look again. I reached the main road and kept driving until the ocean was only a whisper behind me. Weeks later, when I developed the last roll of film, one photo came out that I didn't remember taking. It was the interior of a narrow hallway, wood-paneled, scorched at the edges, and at the far end, a gramophone stood in perfect condition, the needle resting on a spinning record. I still do not know how it appeared among my shots, but I boxed up that film and never touched it again. Sometimes, when the wind is high, I can still hear that same warped waltz playing in my head.